Okay. Okay, so last time we left off talking about generally counterculture in the first place. We started off talking about jazz and then moved into talking about other subjects that came thereafter. So we started with jazz. I think in the 1930s to 1950s was the time period we looked at, and then talked about how various substances started getting introduced through time. So jazz was really big with heroin and alcohol. And then in the 50s, after World War II, the beatniks arose on the East Coast. And that was like a really major signifier of the beginning of the counterculture movement. The beatniks were kind of like anti-establishment, anti-war kind of young people that had started to express themselves in unique ways. And then across the pond in the late 50s, early 60s were the Mods and the Rockers, who were like the moped gang of the UK. And that was like the club movement over there. And then meanwhile, on the West Coast in the mid 60s, the counterculture movement in the West Coast was unfurling in the form of the further bus in particular was really major. The Human Be-In, which was in the mid late 60s, a protest to the newly enforced drug laws. And then Woodstock, of course, Timothy Leary, all kinds of these huge influential figures. So this all sprung out of, well, I'd be very curious about your experience with methaclone. This all kind of sprung out of these two coasts and across the pond, simultaneously having these ideologies spring up and collide. And a lot of different things happened very quickly. And we're going to kind of like recap as we go, because the general historical timeline is jazz was becoming popularized as like dance music, almost clubbing style. And then that moved further into like bongos and spoken word poetry for beatniks. And then elements of Black American soul music started getting pulled in overseas, which we'll talk about. And then that became transformed into another genre of music called Northern Soul, or genre of music is kind of an iffy terminology for it, but another kind of style of clubbing and club music was Northern Soul, which we'll get to in a second. And then from there, that kind of developed further into disco music because Northern Soul was over 100 beats per minute. Things were speeding up, and the introduction of amphetamines into the scene is partially responsible for this. Because again, clubs didn't have liquor licenses a lot of the time, so people would use amphetamines instead, because amphetamine salts and sniffers were becoming very popular, especially among the beatniks. So the music got faster. Jazz elements were influenced, as well as soul elements. Then soul took over and disco sprung out from that. And then we're in the 70s and disco's raging, and we haven't gone past that yet. So today we're going to kind of wrap some additional things into that like 30s through 60s, 70s period, and then move all the way to present day. So just to quickly go over it again, the generally considered, what have historically generally been considered club drugs because they've been used in a club, generally speaking. Everything has been and can be used in a club, to be clear, are nitrous, MDMA, quaaludes, which are no longer really around, although they're making kind of a comeback right now. Interestingly, I really kind of wonder what the push for that is. And by making a comeback, I mean people are trying to introduce analogs into the market. Like I think it's SQL 164 or something. I think I might have mentioned it last time. Ketamine and cocaine and amphetamines and poppers. These are generally, poppers less so, I would say. These are generally considered to be like the major club drugs outside of alcohol, which is a drug. So just as a quick introduction to this concept, rave, the word rave means radical audiovisual experience, but it was introduced, and this is actually, it's called Rave On. This song's called Rave On. So this is 1958. And the word rave initially was used to basically mean like you don't want the party to end. And this was coined for like kind of the wild Soho parties of New York City during the late 50s, beatnik parties. They were referred to as raves and ravers because they were like, oh, we're all over this. We don't want this to stop. So the word rave actually did originate with the beatniks, which really just like pulls it all together. And then it also moved across the pond as things started changing in the UK. The word rave and ravers started applying to people and events in the UK as well for the mods and rockers. Again, this is like late 50s, get out of here, early 60s. Then from there, we started seeing soul music from America. Black artists in America were producing soul music. And the UK was like, that's cool. I like that. So it was appropriated. Or in many cases, it was developed within Black communities in the UK. But it became very mainstream, became very popular within white communities as well in the UK. In particular, London, I believe. And I think that this was actually one of the primary elements of the Twisted Wheel and Marquee, which were two major mod and rocker clubs in the UK. So the music that was played started to change. It started to speed up, as I mentioned. A kind of shuffle was developed for it, like a kind of dance for it. This is Northern Soul.
It's a funny, funny thing. You know, everybody believes that love is all about money. But you know, I'm a strong believer that love, true love is from the heart.
So remember, things getting faster and faster. And this was really the period of time where people started looking for like actual individual DJs. This was never really a thing that was paid much attention to before this. But all of a sudden, like the actual DJ that was coming on was having their own like really significant effects, and DJing became like a thing as time went on, right? As discotheques became popularized. And that was like really, you can feel the segue immediately from jazz and soul, etc., all the way into Northern Soul. And that is like an immediate indicator of when things started to really turn and change. And this became kind of like, I think that raving was a term that was applied to certain kinds of rock as well. But then we move into disco and discotheque. And we're going to skip over a little time period right now and move to the late 80s, because discotheque we kind of covered a little bit before. But acid house, this genre of music, acid house, was basically the thing that started I would say most modern genres of rave music was acid house, and Frankie Knuckles in particular, who was a Black DJ from Chicago. And Frankie Knuckles completely revolutionized the way that clubs played music and the way that people conceptualized dance music.
At that time, it was anything that Frankie Knuckles would play at the warehouse, which was the coolest underground dance music.
Some groups you wouldn't hear anywhere else except for the warehouse, which is what you would crave. Like, I only heard that song here.
You'd have Europe and Philadelphia and New York all playing on the same dance floor.
No matter what style of music was, if it fit into the set, it worked. So you heard all sounds, textures in the course of the night.
Some of the records were too short, so Frankie would mess with them and have two copies and make them longer, and also like play the breakdown twice or play the best part a couple of times or skip the shitty part.
I mean, I almost couldn't quite figure out if there were songs at one time, because sometimes it was just like this sort of soundscape.
And this is a really important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at the history of rave. And considering the fact that this genre of music is, in particular house music, Chicago-based house music, was truly the originator of most modern electronic music as it is today. Like, we do not adequately credit the fact that this genre started in Black communities, was perpetuated by Black communities, and now somehow we've ended up with club scenes and rave culture that is almost entirely white. So I've mentioned this before, but this really begs a super important question. It's not like this music is no longer popular. It is extremely popular in the way that it's been transformed over time. It is extremely popular. It is like climbing in popularity every day. It's electronic music. You know, electronic music is enormous and constantly evolving. Yet the same people that have created these sounds in the first place are nowhere to be seen on lineups. You know, we have like Black Coffee is on lineups and stuff like that. there are producers, plenty of Black producers that are still making music that has been spun off of this, but there is just like an enormous racial disparity in who is actually booked on major tickets, on major lineups. If we're ravers in here, we should all be paying attention to this. So Acid House started as kind of a scrappy art. You know, it wasn't a high-tech thing. It was using whatever synths were available. It was like the ultimate DIY homespun kind of deal. And from there, it got transformed into so many other genres of music like jungle and drum and bass and hardcore and happy hardcore, things that just kept speeding up as time went on. But also from there came break beats and breakbeat hardcore, speedcore, terrorcore, like whatever you want to call it. There are like probably, I don't know, 50, 100 genres of rave music that have come through the years. And I would say that most of them originated from Acid House. If not, then clubbing incorporating Acid House originated from Acid House. Like it was really the starting point for a lot of these things. Yeah, Detroit techno, Detroit and Chicago were really birthplaces of this kind of music, and it was brought overseas. It was incorporated into European club scenes. Meanwhile, in America, we're in the late 80s right now, and enter club kids. I have a feeling there's usually one or two people in every course of DrugsCo that I teach that is like all over club kid culture and knows a lot about club kids and is like super familiar with this. If that's you, put a finger up in the chat. So club kids basically were like this explosion of boundary breaking, hedonistic, very outward facing defiance of general social and societal rules. This was kind of like after Warhol, when Warhol had turned pop culture on its head, we had club kids, which were young kids in New York City who were just like completely gender bending, who were outwardly using substances of all kinds, who were extremely flamboyant and open and fluid in sexuality and presentation. And club kids started this trend of what were called outlaw parties. Now, here's one outlaw party in a McDonald's. It's literally just
to be here at McDonald's. It's such a thrill. My water's breaking, excuse me. I'm gonna pick you up at 7:30. How are you? I couldn't believe it. Then, as soon as I got rid of my gonorrhea, he wouldn't fist me anymore.
So this was like a very performative, very this was meant to make noise. This movement was meant to make noise. And Michael Allig was at the heart of this movement. His name was Michael Allig. Some of you, it looks like there's no club kid aficionado in this particular crew, which is really fun for me because I get to introduce this incredibly gruesome murder that took place. But these outlaw parties would basically just choose a random public location like a Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's and just flood it with club kids or flood it with club goers. It was like the coolest party that you could possibly get invited to, was just like storming this capitalist establishment and setting up your home base there until you got kicked out. After which point you would make your way to the actual club, which more often than not was the Limelight. So the Limelight was this incredibly, again, I can't even recycle these words enough, incredibly hedonistic, incredibly outward facing drug using establishment that was just the hottest club in New York City. And Michael Allig was, like I said, at the heart of this entire enterprise. This is Michael Allig. And this is Angel. The Limelight had a massive drug dealing operation going on. It was just kind of like a standard issue deal that if you were at the Limelight, you were doing drugs or selling drugs or both. And there was this like huge long history of drug use among club kids. It was so consistent. It was so intense. It was so constant that there was just like a massive amount of debauchery going on and a lot of money exchanging hands. Now, Angel was kind of like brought in and friends with Michael and was one of the dealers of the Limelight. And one night, there was an argument over, I believe it was heroin, of like whose heroin was whose back at the apartment. And Michael Allig Oh, how did it go exactly? I believe that what happened was he clubbed Michael over the head, strangled him or smothered him to death with a pillow, and then poured bleach into his mouth and taped it shut, put him in a bathtub, and then dismembered him and threw him in a river. I think that's how it went. I should have brushed up on that beforehand, but I'm pretty sure that's how this murder went. It was an extremely gruesome murder. And a child actually found the box that washed up on shore with all of the body parts in it. And Michael was not caught for a while after that. He was released from prison, I think in 2014, and has not shown a particular amount of remorse. Whoops. Hello? There we go.
It was pretty tragic once they started investigating Peter, because that meant the end of doing lines on the bar, of, you know, the just tossing the drugs in the air, and, you know.
Any party favors going on this evening?
Yes. Can I talk about them on TV?
Oh, but of course.
Okay, like lots of coke, K, ecstasy, rohypnol. I don't know. I just like to do a little bit of everything.
Well, make sure you have some for all of us to share.
Okay, I will.
Somebody give me drugs.
And I'm shrooming my ass off, and I'm in a cave hole right now, so I don't really know what to say.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the king and queen of Manhattan pageant.
It started out where you had to pay them to show up, $100. Then you had to pay them to show up and give them drinks. Then you had to pay them to show up, give them drinks and a dinner. Then you had to pay them to show up, give them drinks, a dinner, and buy them drugs. They came in expecting a vial of coke and a vial of K.
Darn, that special kick is kicking in, honey. Our next contestant is the one, the only, genitalia.
As part of that scene, you don't even realize drugs are illegal. You're like, you know, you're just not living in the real world.
I don't even know where I am right now, so...
Nobody thought they were doing anything wrong, I don't think. You know, just your judgment is blurred, and reality is not, it's not real. I mean, you're just not in reality. So, I don't know.
Drugs have become like drink tickets. You give out a bump or two instead of a drink ticket. They would rather have a bump than a drink ticket.
Freeze, ladies and gentlemen.
What would the first thing you would do as reigning king? Give Michael a raise. Give Michael a raise. Thank you, darling.
Give Michael a raise so he can buy us more drugs, right?
And then it trickles down to the, hi, I'm Joe Blow. Where's my bottle of Coke? And I guess eventually Joe Blow was a DEA agent.
It was pretty tragic once they started investigating Peter, because that meant the end of doing lines on the bar, of, the just tossing the drugs in the air, and,
So Party Monster is a great little documentary if you're curious about the rest of this, because there's so much more to the story. Like, this is a very complicated period of time in raving and rave culture, because this really did kind of initiate the shift. This Limelight Club was different from Studio 54, but you can kind of see the blend there, right? We have Studio 54 in the 80s. I think it was the 80s. It must have been. And Studio 54 was also in New York, and it also had this incredibly flamboyant, outrageous atmosphere. And it was also supportive of gender bending and of all of these hedonistic behaviors that had previously been not really tolerated socially. But at the end of discotheques, moving into clubs that incorporated these kind of like silly, bizarre, surrealist elements to them became the basis upon which the Limelight gained so much popularity. And for both of these clubs, it was difficult to get in. And Michael Alec in particular would like stand in a cage, and there'd be a sign on it that said, "Don't feed the drug monster." And people would just give him bumps of whatever they had through the cage. And he also at one point, I think, peed off of the balcony onto people and started becoming pretty aggressive with his power. Things really did not go well near the end of the limelight before it was shut down for reasons that are probably obvious. So this enters raving. Raving has been around since the late 80s. Since the start of acid house, warehouse parties became a thing. I would say approximately acid house era, mid-late 80s. And then from there, starting in the early 90s, raving began developing. And the word rave started taking on different forms. The music got faster and more intense, a little darker. It became a little bit more secretive. Raving could happen in clubs, but then at a point, there were non-alcoholic venues, but there were also curfews, 2 a.m. curfews instilled on clubs. And this is really what mainly forced raves underground, like literally underground in the mid-late 90s. It was that this curfew on clubs started happening, and there would be up to 25,000 people at raves at this point in time. It was like raving was like the GOAT, And there was a ton of different music being played. There were genres all over the place. I would say mid 90s was probably mostly breakbeats, house music and techno. Techno was really big at this point. Some hardcore and happy hardcore, which we'll get to in a second. And this was just like this revolution in how people gathered and why people gathered and the ways that people gathered. We have Frankie Bones, who brought this concept of the rave to the United States in a new way. And Frankie Bones was a very prominent UK DJ. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, these were massive, multi-thousand people parties. They would happen in train yards and in sewage drains and under bridges and warehouses first and foremost, right? Like it was a lot easier to go unpermitted in warehouses because we didn't have social media at the time. And then after, I would say like early 2000s or so, raving started getting kind of like forced even further and further and further underground because of more curfews and more crackdowns on these kinds of gatherings. They got smaller. There were no longer stadium raves. In Los Angeles, there was the Hotel Alexandria. Is anyone familiar with the Hotel Alexandria parties? Possibly. Doesn't look like it. But there were lots of locations in LA in particular, in New York City, that were like, LA was huge during this era. LA was like the place, and New York, and obviously those two places. But this kind of was like early 2000s, things started changing. The nature of how people interfaced with rave started changing, which was very prevalent. Here we have 1992 Fantasia, the New Year's party in, I believe that was in New York. I think so. Underground started becoming a thing. So an underground rave, as opposed to a permitted rave, an above ground rave, an overground rave that's in a club, that's in a permitted facility. Underground raving began emerging out of necessity. Like, where else are you going to do it? And you have to keep it secret. You have to keep it from the cops. And there were multiple ways that this happened. The first was through an info line. And oftentimes an info line was a phone number. And usually you would get a flyer like this into your mailbox or delivered in person or something like that, that would have the lineup, information about the admission, and then an info line, 1-800-4-RAVE line. And that would give you more information about the party. It would usually just go straight to voicemail or be like a pre-recorded message. And it would just like tell you generally where you're supposed to go to get the next steps. And you can even see on here, it says map point after 8 p.m. on December 31st. And what that means is that there's a location, like you get an address. Sometimes it was latitude and longitude, and you would go to this location and there'd be someone there waiting for you. Now, depending on the secrecy of the rave, there could be different things that happened at this point. One of them is that you were told via the info line, basically, like, look for the guy in the green jacket and ask him if he knows where the nearest coffee shop is or something. And from there, he's gonna like tell you the address, or he's gonna point you in the right direction, or he's gonna tell you where to wait for a van that will pick you up and take you to the party. And there were tons of different things. And let me be clear, this is happening in 2021. This is, 2020, it was before the world shut down. I don't know if map point raves are happening right now, but the underground scene is alive and thriving. Let me tell you, like, as recently as a couple of years ago, I bore witness to many map point. Actually, no, it was like a year and a half ago, right before the pandemic. There were map point parties happening in LA, where you would need to go to a location and be like, ask the guy for the green triangle, and then you'd show up at the door. And if you didn't have the green triangle, then you wouldn't be allowed in, because if you skipped the map point, there's no one to verify that you're not a narc. So this was just like two-factor authentication. This was like before Google Authenticator, you had the info line and the map point. And this just created this whole new level of like secrecy, of word of mouth, of tight-knit or tighter-knit communities. This really did craft a sense of you have to work to be here. It created a very particular kind of environment. And in my experience, raves that have info lines and map points, preferably both, because that's way more fun, have a really specific kind of crowd of people that really want to go to this party. It's not enough to just like type in like what's happening tonight. People really went out of their way to attend this event. Now, a pretty prominent, if you're in Dallas, there's definitely some warehouse raves going down, super underground. That's really disappointing. There should be no raves right now, I say as a public health worker and event employee. I feel very strongly about this. We're going to be stuck in this limbo forever, and essential workers that can't consent to being at gatherings are going to be exposed to people that have voluntarily exposed themselves to COVID. That's my sentiment. But I would love to go in the future. So introducing gabber, and gabber is one of the premier genres of like quintessential early rave music in the UK. It's a very silly genre of music that has a very particular kind of dance. Yeah, gabber is, like I said, very particular. It's very fast. It's very popular in the Netherlands. It's known for its windbreaker attire and like kick dancing and shit. Gabber has a very kind of cult following right now, exemplified by the Thunderdome. This was the late 90s. The Thunderdome is going on its 27th anniversary, I think, right now. And the Thunderdome was kind of just like the mecca for hard dance music in the 90s in Amsterdam. Pupil check. You can see immediately.
Heel veel. Hardcore power komt uit op Hellsound, nummer 9.
I love Dutch because to me it sounds like I'm just not hearing English correctly. So, yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy. Yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy is a really funny compilation series on YouTube of people that are just like really high at raves doing all kinds of stuff. So Thunderdome is kind of just like a real indicator of how popular this stuff is and was, and how long this has been going on for, but also how deeply different music was. This was only 25 years ago that this happened. You know, like 25 years is not that much time. And yet music has changed so significantly. Meanwhile, over in America, we have parties like Dune. This was 1997. Dune was a legendary party. The Dune series was just fully legend, California, dusk till dawn desert parties of the 90s. And the whistles were very... Everyone that put their head in a bass bin during this time period is really hard of hearing now. So, Sean, there is a Discord. There's been a Discord since day one. You can see it in the welcome email. You can find a link for it. Triangle monolith. So that genre that you, or that, not necessarily that genre, but like that whole segment that we just went on, it might seem like that's, oh, you know, that's like 90s music. Here we are, I think this is 2019 in New York City. So this stuff is very much not over. Very much not over, and the genres of music that have been played historically have definitely shifted through time, but stuff like this is a kind of like a classic breakbeat hardcore introduction, fast-paced, early electronic music. So this stuff, happy hardcore, represented this like other kind of shift in music from being kind of more like, I don't want to say serious, but the genres of rave music as they moved through the world, there was hardcore, which was more like gabber, the dung 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 dung. And gabber was getting to be a little sillier, you know, a little bit more hand wavy, a little bit more body flappy and kicky and whatever. And then hardcore took over from there, which was a similar vein, but more cheesy piano breakdowns. And then happy hardcore emerged. And happy hardcore is the epitome of just like ridiculous music. HTID, which means hardcore till I die. So there's a whole culture around happy hardcore still to this day, and it's evolved to become new school hardcore as opposed to old school hardcore, which means that it's more modernized and includes more or higher production quality, of course, because there's more technology available. But happy hardcore was one of the genres that really pushed this shift into candy kid raving. If you've ever been to an underground rave before, if you've been especially to multiple kinds, you'll know that an underground techno rave is completely different than an underground happy hardcore rave, or even an underground house music rave. Like the genre of music played at a rave, especially an underground one, very much dictates the kind of costuming, if any, that takes place. Let's just say that jungle is a lot of camo and black and chains usually. Techno is all black head to toe, and usually those musician hats, if you know what I'm talking about. House music is completely variable, and I would say is possibly one of the more accessible genres of electronic music that is pretty much everywhere. Depending on the kind, though, there's so much house music. There's deep house, acid house, melodic house, progressive house. Like there's so many different kinds, melodic vocal, progressive house, so many different specific genres of this music, and they all attract very particular kinds of people. Again, if you're familiar with these genres at all, you would know that a liquid drum and bass rave is super different than a drum and bass rave, or let alone a neurofunk rave or a jungle rave, which are all, they might sound the same to someone that is not as familiar. But hardcore, happy hardcore in particular, pushed us towards the introduction of candy, which are these bracelets that this person is wearing. I actually knew this person from the San Diego hardcore scene. This was the San Diego like legal rave venue from, I want to say probably like 2012 to 2014 or 2015, during the peak years of this kind of raving, where candy was just like a standard part of things. And candy originated years before this. And initially, people would show up to raves with their colored bracelets that were an indicator of what they were selling. And that was not widely enough communicated. So people were like, oh, fun bracelets, and started making them. And then people would approach each other and be like, what you got on deck? And then that trade, or the trend of using candy as an indicator of your drugs on hand started fizzling out. So after a while, this practice of making and trading candy became this like cultural staple, especially of mainstream EDM music. EDM music isn't redundant. EDM, electronic dance music. It started becoming the staple of EDM, where especially I would say late or early 2010s, like maybe 2009 to 2012 was when this trend exploded of approaching someone. You'd have your armful of candy. These are called 3D cuffs. They're like huge, actual intricate geometric cuffs that take a long time to make. These are chunkies where they have like baby toys on them and stuff like that. It's really popular to like raid at Goodwill or an Ambets and pull chunkies and make candy out of them. I had a friend once that put an entire Etch-a-Sketch on a candy and gifted it to someone who was really grateful at the time, but I'm not sure how grateful they were when they sobered up. And then you have singles, which are like the regular single set of these, like I don't have me on hand right now. But the idea is if you like someone, especially at a rave, you would just go up to them and you would ask if they wanted to trade, or you would just hold out your hand like this. And if they wanted to trade back, you would go peace, love, unity, and then you would drag the candy over onto their wrist. And that brings me to plur, which is a phrase that I honestly kind of hate, like a lot, because it's used to excuse people's shitty predatory behaviors, because plur, right? But it means peace, love, unity, respect, and sometimes there's another R for responsibility. And the idea behind this is basically like we want to create a plur environment, like we want to create a safe environment, which is cool, except that a lot of ravers don't actually uphold that. And they use it as an excuse for if anyone's like, hey, this is bad. Someone's like, plur. The plur police is what it became known as. There's so much lore here, guys. There's a lot of lore, a lot of little insider frustrations. And ultimately, initially, the beginning of plur actually was when Frankie Bones, the well-known DJ from the UK, actually turned off the music because there was a fight at the stage. And he was like, can we get some fucking peace, love, unity, and respect in here? And it was intended to break up the fight, like an argument, but then it got co-opted to refer to peace, love, unity, and respect at raves. Now we're in the UK, just like this is King's Cross in London, just like showing different things across the world happening at the same time. We have Dune, the Desert Party. Meanwhile, we have, and this is hardcore. This would be considered hardcore, probably. It gets iffy. It's all sweat. The whistles, the noisemakers, staples of this kind of stuff. And peace, love, and unity movement. That's interesting. Yeah, hardcore is a genre that has stemmed from many, many things. And then here we are, 2009. I'm skipping over a couple of years because the early 2000s had a lot of like kind of continuations of that kind of raving that had their own flavors and evolutions. But it was really 2008, 2009, I would say, when things started changing. This was one of the first EDCs, Electric Dancing Carnival. Dusk. And to be clear, EDC is now the largest festival in North America with 450,000 attendees. It was just rescheduled from May to October because May was a stupid pipe dream that would endanger thousands of people. So I'm glad that that happened. I'm looking at you, Pascal Rotella. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly. I'm looking at you, head of Insomniac. Be responsible. Be responsible. So here's 2009. Just take a look at how things have changed. Under the electric sky. Welcome to the Electric Daisy Carnival. So now all of a sudden we had this shift, this transition from what was initially fully underground, because clubs started having their curfews and things got moved into warehouses again, and other underground venues like train yards was a really big one as well in LA. And all of a sudden we have this surge of production quality, this surge of desire to attend electronic music shows. And there were some really major artists during this time. Oh, probably Tiesto, if I had to guess. Tiesto was one of the big ones that was part of this initial movement towards like big production heavy festivals. Because remember that underground raves had like thousands of people, like tens of thousands of people at this point in time, up until very recently before this. And as the restrictions got tighter, it became necessary to move into a more controlled mainstream legal environment. So underground raving became festivals through that mechanism of necessity, partially, because the production needed to go up and it just wasn't possible. But the style, you know, you can really feel the difference in the style of this time period, musically in particular. I'm trying to find a clip of someone wearing like a classic, right there. Oh no, I missed it. Classic early 2000s, mid 2000s rave outfits were fluffies or fuzzies, which were the fluffy leg warmers. Damn, I can't. Like, yeah, you get the point. Is a lot of like scene haircuts were really big at the time. Like, like the scene kids were really into candy. MySpace was big for raves. And now here we are moving on to Identity Fest in 2012. This was just 3 years later, and look already how different things are. Like, this took off like very few other movements have. The music is different. Immediately you can feel it. This is called a progressive pluck, this sound. Clubbing became popularized, giving light shows that most people don't actually want. Sometimes they do. Sometimes light shows are awesome. Those glasses were really big during this time period. I think I was like 15 or 16 when this happened. I would have been 16 when this happened, and I wanted to go so badly. I could not go. It's Say My Name and I forget who it's by. Yeah. It sounds like maybe Zed's Dead. I mean, not Zed's Dead, Zed, maybe. I think, possibly. So, Amazing Lights and I Heart Raves, you know, stuff like that, where this era of raving was really big on lights. And this was when LEDs were starting to hit the market. And LED lighting, let me tell you guys, LED lighting changed everything for all kinds of production. Having these color-changing LED light strips, having fluorescent LEDs that were really easy to use, revolutionized the way that we could internalize raves, you know, like this time period really put costumes on the map for raving. There was a period where it was like, yeah, you could wear costumes to raves. In the 90s in particular, there was this thing called Liberty Spikes, which is where you just like spike your hair up all over your head. And Liberty Spikes were pretty big for a while, even though they're a huge pain in the ass to do and to maintain. And that was like kind of in this vein, and there definitely was a lot of rave culture in terms of like the outfits. Rave pants, fat pants, PHAT, are those big wide-legged pants, big t-shirts with different colored arms and graphics on them, chokers, frosted tips, like all that stuff was really in for rave fashion. But in terms of doing costuming, like really going all out on having like a festival outfit was pushed quite a bit by this time period. You can even see that person wearing their Candy singles right there. You see that? And here is just like, you know, these are bros. a lot of the time. This changed the way that bro culture interacted, like frat culture interacted with raving. That was previously kind of a dorky activity to a lot of people. And then you have stuff like Electric Forest. And this is 2018, so we're really moving forward in time right now. But the emphasis started changing drastically as time went on, as promoters became more aware of the fact that they could really capitalize on the transportive element of this, especially because people would come to these events, do a lot of drugs, be completely transported in that space, mentally, physically, sensory, the works. And then they would like leave and it would be like magic, like it all just disappeared. And it became very important over time to create an immersive experience. It was no longer as appealing to just have the music there, to just have the setup. And now was like, there are rides, there are games, there's like massive art installations, there are themed areas, there are cool down zones. Eventually there are water stations. Like, the production of these things just went through the roof as time went on exponentially. So here we are in 2018 with Electric Forest. And Electric Forest is like that. There's an entire forest, like a literal forest of Electric Forest that is completely transformed into an immersive environment with like things to do and performances. You could spend the whole time just in the forest discovering stuff at the bases of trees and things. There's so much to do, you know? There's so much to do. It becomes a city in a way, a performative, an art space. So we go, in a matter of 20 years, we go from Dune in the desert, just speaker stacks and people vibing out. We go from Dune in the desert or warehouse parties to speedway events where it's like, okay, this is legal and we're doing this in broad daylight right now, to something like Identity Fest, which is a little bit more themed. And then we get into the territory of EDC as it goes forward in Electric Forest. And there are so many festivals that I could bring in here that represent different elements of different things. There's transformative festivals, which are more focused on like the holistic aspect of like, attend workshops on how to grow your own sustainable garden and get a massage from this dude and pay $1 to have a guy write a poem about you and like cross this bridge and go swimming in the lake with a bunch of people you've never met and stuff like that. Transformative festivals tend to have a lot of appropriation in them because they want to pull on the like spiritual dynamics of other cultures, and they often have like big teepees and shit where you can go to get your spirit animal read or whatever, which is a big problem. Others are a lot better about it. There are some that kind of toe the line, like Lightning in a Bottle has had elements of both for sure. There are others like Okeechobee that doesn't try to be as transformative. There are others like Lucidity, which I can't comment on. But there's this whole transformative festival circuit. So this changed really drastically. It's split off into multiple different kinds. You have speedway festivals still, which are predominantly about like seeing the DJ sets, riding the rides, getting the food and the drinks and stuff like that. It's more of a Vegas kind of feel. You have camping festivals, which are more about like building community with the people you camp with and having like a home base on site. And usually people get a lot more tired and handle their drugs a lot more poorly by the end because they're so exhausted and cranky. And then you have transformative festivals, which are about the holistic development of the experience. And at other times you have like art and music festivals, which are very much like artists come and vend. There's a lot of live painting. A good example of this is Resonance Festival, which is Papadosio's festival in Pittsburgh, or outside of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So there's something for everyone now. Like festivals are about, they have become about building an experience as opposed to facilitating an experience, if that makes sense. And not all of them are like that. You know, you have things like Ultra and Govball and stuff, which are not nearly as focused on the immersive element, but are like really tailored towards bringing people together for specific musical elements. And then you have stuff like Lost Lands. For those of you that hate bass music, you're about to hear some of it. I'm sorry. So things like dubstep and rhythm and shit like that. But also have this very specific kind of daytime campground atmosphere. There's actually, for those of you that are metalheads and think that you hate this stuff, you'd probably find quite a lot of similarity, except that generally bass heads have no idea how to mosh without hurting people and do it drunk. So that's something to be aware of. And then meanwhile, also in 2014, you have like in the, I'm not going to give too many specifics because I'm not supposed to, but this is on YouTube also. So like whatever. There's stuff like Moon Tribe, which is a gathering that takes place on the West Coast that is word of mouth. And it's like a one-night pop-up desert party that has totally different vibes to everything else. But you can hear the change in the sound quality even just from this recording. Again, there's still costuming happening here. So many different flavors of these things. So many different flavors. And then across the pond, you have Berghain, which is the most exclusive nightclub in the world.
So we've heard that it's very difficult to get into this club. Exclusive. Yeah, exclusive.
And you need to look cool.
Yeah.
You've got a face tattoo?
Yes, I have. I have got a face tattoo. Do you think that's going to help me, Gabe?
Have you guys heard any like rumors of what goes on within those walls?
You know, I've Googled, I've tried to find like pictures of inside the club, but I can't find anything. It's what's intriguing me more. We're not getting turned down today. We're getting in. We're getting in. We're getting in. I feel like you've got
We're getting in.
Whoa! A magical dancing pigeon turned up to remind you to like this video and subscribe.
Last night. I think you need clean bottoms.
So these guys end up going.
It was a weird feeling as we joined the queue. Any wrong step would mean that we'd be rejected. The bouncers' eyes were scanning like hawks.
It's such a weird thing though, that everyone's trying so hard to look like they're not trying. Jeez.
Many hopeful people were in the queue, but the reality was that most wouldn't make it through those doors. As the doors opened, the walk of shame for many people began. As we edged closer, it got quieter. As a sign of respect, everyone was on their best behavior. We couldn't be seen on our phones or it'd be game over. Even our friend who was filming had the security flashing a torch to stop her. So as the lights inside turned on, the world's most exclusive party had begun. And
so they end up getting in. This is a really fun video. They end up getting in and they're just kind of like, whoa. Afterwards, they're like, we can't even talk about what happened because we now respect and understand the sanctity of it. The exclusivity of these things has also evolved through time. Like Moon Tribe, for instance, is all word of mouth. You know, I probably shouldn't even be mentioning it here. There are other parties on the West Coast where like you need to know that it exists. You need to be invited by someone that already knows it exists. And you are responsible for the person that you invite. So for instance, if that person has a consent violation, then you are called in to take care of it and haul your friend away and you're not invited back. So this kind of exclusivity has become more prevalent in these environments because of how mainstream raving became. It became very much like anyone can come. So just a quick tour of a couple of different genres of electronic music. Here we have jungle. Jungle originated, I think, probably early 80s, if I had to guess. Maybe late 80s. Then you have raga jungle. Then you have stuff that started it all, like Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites from Skrillex. 2011, maybe 2010. This really set things off. This pushed everything onto the radio for the first time. Say what you will about Skrillex, but he put EDM on the map in this way, for sure. Put dubstep super on the map. Then you have more melodic sing-along stuff like Cash Cash. This also, I think, was around 2012, maybe, if I had to guess. This brought in a very particular kind of sound, a very particular kind of like sing-along vibe that mixed pop with EDM. Then you have stuff like Ganja White Night, which is more in the realm of like dubsteppy, rhythmy, but not quite. There's a lot of raga influence here. And then you have stuff like early Gammer, who's a happy hardcore artist or a hardcore artist. You know, you have the cheesy piano breaks and stuff. This was early 2000s, I think, maybe like early mid 2000s. Really feel like getting faster and faster and faster and faster. And that moves into drum and bass. Toom, 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 toom. Then you have huge drum and bass festivals like, oh God, like Liquidity. Oh God, I'm gonna run out of time. Yeah, so your mom probably warned you, don't go to raves, there are lots of drugs, and she was totally right. There are lots of drugs at raves, like all of them. There are very few rave environments where there are not gonna be lots of drugs. Like everything is there, honest to God. MDMA became really popular for a reason because it was like the sociable love drug, like sensory enhancement substance, whatever. But I would say that things like candy and Molly are a little more common in like the kind of squishier rave genres, like hardcore. I would say that acid is more popular at like house-oriented festivals and stuff like that. But that's a really broad generalization. You'll find both in both places. I would say the more black the attendees wear, the less likely they are to be rolling. But like actually though. Now, real quick, before we run out of time, I want to quickly get into Burning Man. Might have to finish this up next time. 1986, you're at Baker Beach in San Francisco. This is the original Burning Man, a group of friends that built their effigy, which was a wooden figure of a man, and brought it down to the beach to burn it. Initially, this was just kind of just like this gathering of friends to kick it and be stupid, but then they moved it to the desert. And in 1991, they built the first actual light up man. Now, originally the rules were fairly simple. I think it was something like respect everyone's autonomy and no guns in center camp, which was like the only centralized area where stuff is bought and sold. As of 2019, Burning Man is a completely different experience. It is held in the Black Rock Desert of Nevada in a fairly inhospitable environment. You need to be prepared to survive in the desert for a week. Like literally nothing is provided for you except porta potties, and the streets are marked. And you can buy ice and coffee in center camp, and that's it. Everything else at Burning Man is gifted. Nothing is bought or sold except for ice and coffee. This is called a mutant vehicle or an art car. And every single thing at Burning Man is built and brought by the same exact people that pay to go. Nothing is provided. This is all built and brought by participants. So this is very much, Burning Man is very much a canvas of, okay, we're all going to be gathered here. What are we going to build? What are we going to share? What are we going to make? There's a lot of privilege at Burning Man, like an extraordinary amount. A huge percentage of people have higher education at Burning Man and have been able to afford it and access it. It is almost entirely white, even though there are 80,000 people that attend the city every year. And it is a city. It is literally like recognized by the United States Post Office as being a city that you can mail stuff to. All of this dust that you see is alkaline, so if you breathe it in, you are at risk of respiratory failure, which is why everyone always, if they know what they're doing, carries a gas mask or a dust mask with them, as well as dust-proofed goggles, as well as a shitload of water, because if there's a dust storm and you're stuck in the middle of nowhere in the desert, you're fucked. And then there's stuff like this, just like electronic couches and stuff. There was one guy that put a motor in a washing machine, so it was remote controlled, and it would just run up to you in camp and start attacking you. And there are art cards that are just like insanely detailed, like this one. Paris Hilton DJs on my friend's art car. Anything can happen at Burning Man. Case in point, anything can happen at Burning Man. There's El Popo Mechanico. Honestly, there's so much to say about it, and we're out of time, so I'll finish saying stuff about it next time because I don't want to cut this one short. Okay, guys. I will see you on Tuesday. I'm sorry for canceling this past Tuesday. And I'll stick around for questions for just a minute tonight. And other than that, have a great night.